Hello and welcome to Optiv's inaugural Source ZeroCon. My name is Omar Santos. I couldn't be more excited to kick off this 3-day experience with you. Over the next 3 days, you will have the opportunity to participate in different workshops, hear from different speakers from red, blue, purple teams, and also talk to peers on the Discord server. I want to highlight a lot the Discord server and for you to communicate and collaborate with each other. This conference is amazing in that respect. You will be able to meet so many people here in these 3 days. Also, you will be able to earn different CPE credits for your certification and much more. My presentation today is focused on vulnerability research, vulnerability management, and vulnerability disclosure and coordination, which is an important topic of today. So we have a lot of material to cover, so let's get started. During this presentation, I would like to share a few real-life stories and a bit of my personal story to basically help you understand a few of the concepts and the history of the topics that I'm about to share with you related to vulnerability research, vulnerability coordination, and disclosure. So let's go back in time. It is 1999. I was a very young guy. I was in the United States Marine Corps, and I was working on different tasks to help prepare and, of course, maintain secure communications between our troops and other participants. Now, during my spare time, I collaborated with organizations in the private sector and sometimes basically had to report security vulnerabilities and security problems to, often many different companies, right? Now, in many times also, I did this by basically just picking up the phone. And another times, actually connecting to a dial-up connection. And then sending an email. Now, very often I will yell to people, hey, get off the freaking phone. I'm trying to connect and send an email. I'm trying to report this vulnerability and I cannot get a hold of anybody, right? Or if I actually pick up the phone and I call somebody, I will get a busy signal or I will get, some, voicemail. We didn't have, very sophisticated, systems at that time. Now, if you fast forward, it is 2021, and I still have to pick up the phone sometimes, and I still often try to figure out what is the proper email to report a vulnerability to an organization. So once again, it is 2021. The cars were supposed to be flying right now instead of self-driving. A lot of the technologies was supposed to actually, accelerate a lot. We have machine learning, we have artificial intelligence, we have a lot of advances. Yet, whenever I find a vulnerability or my team finds a vulnerability or we are coordinating some type of vulnerability disclosure, I often have to also pick up the phone, try to figure out who to contact in an organization, and more importantly, in some cases, even sending an email and the proper email address on a company to report a vulnerability is often a nightmare. Sometimes you actually cannot find it, right? In many cases, actually vendors or even smaller companies or multi-billion-dollar companies, they don't even have an email still nowadays to send a report or a PSIRT team, a product security incident response team. That's what I belong to in my company. They don't even have that. And again, we're not only talking about the very, very small companies that are startups. I'm talking about multi-billion-dollar companies that we use their product and they're part of the supply chain. And that's what I'm going to go over today. It's a lot of different types of, best practices and challenges at the same time that we're facing on a daily basis whenever it comes not only to vulnerability disclosure, but vulnerability coordination whenever vulnerability affects multiple parties. By the way, if you don't know what is a PSIRT or a Product Security Incident Response Team, I invite you to navigate to this page in FIRST. FIRST stands for the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. we actually have created a services framework that defines all the types of responsibility of a PSIRT, how a company, a vendor, or any company can instantiate and create a PSIRT team. So I'll definitely invite you to become familiar with this, and the link is in the bottom of the screen here. Also in FIRST, we have created this document that is titled Guidelines and Practices for Multi-Party Vulnerability Coordination and Disclosure. Typically, or historically, the process for coordinating vulnerabilities and vulnerability disclosures actually have focused primarily on a bilateral coordination. That means between, let's say, a security researcher and a vendor, or a security researcher and an open source maintainer, or an open source component creator. Now, the process of vulnerability coordination nowadays, in many cases, actually it is a lot more complicated than just a two-party or bilateral coordination. And specifically, since pretty much everybody in the world is actually using things like open source software or any other types of shared code, this complexity increases significantly, right? So this multi-party coordination, it is very complicated nowadays. And the reason that we actually are putting our heads together, it's actually as a call to action to everybody. This is not only something that started in the U.S. But as a matter of fact, some of these multi-party coordination issues were highlighted by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That's a mouthful, or the NTIA. That is actually part of the United States Department of Commerce. But then it was actually they joined forces with the FIRST international community to potentially try to address this challenge, right? But we are very far from having a perfect solution. Now, there are indeed other standards, like, yes, the ISO 2900, and specifically, 29147, and the ISO 3000 or 30111 or 3111. Now, those standards were mainly focused into a group of things, specifically vendors. However, in this case, this goes actually way beyond vendors. Everybody nowadays is actually using, again, open source software that in some cases is actually maintained by one or two people, right? And I'm going to go over a few types of use cases on where, things have gone extremely well, right, in this process. And, unfortunately, not often this actually is the case, right? And the other thing that I want to highlight in this presentation is for you to understand how, as an industry, we do have to evolve. Doesn't matter if you're part of a vendor, if you're part of a research institution. So, for example, if you're a security researcher, that's actually something that I will please invite you to become familiar with, with all these type of concepts that I'm going to be introducing here, because you are the heart, right, of that vulnerability disclosure, and specifically, in many cases, that's how the process starts. But I'm not talking about, hey, yes, always report vulnerabilities. Everybody actually already knows that it is a good thing, and to adopt coordinated and good practices on vulnerability disclosures from a researcher to a company. That is something that we have evolved, and there's many best practices, and the industry is getting a lot better. What I'm talking about is that from the time that a vulnerability it is disclosed or shared by a security researcher or found internally in an organization or by a customer, the process of not only reporting the vulnerability to the vendor, but also coordinating whenever that vulnerability may affect other vendors or other downstream or upstream providers, right? It is a significant challenge, right? So let's take a look at, for example, I have this diagram for quite some time in the screen right now. So let's say, we are a security researcher, we found a vulnerability, and I'll give you the perfect scenario. A good friend, his name is Matti van Hoff. He's a brilliant security researcher from Europe. He has found a plethora of security vulnerabilities in the WPA protocol. Actually, this started a few years ago, where he found 10 vulnerabilities affecting the WPA version 1 and WPA version 2. Now, at that time, again, this is a few years ago, he was basically playing with open source components like the WPA supplicant and host APD. And also, he was doing some research with Cisco gear. And as you probably already know, I work for Cisco. I'm a principal engineer, part of the PSIRT team. So he reported the vulnerability to us. A good friend of mine, Dario and me, we picked up the report and we looked at each other and we said, hey, this actually doesn't affect Cisco. This affects pretty much everybody in the industry. At that time, again, this was several years ago, we communicated, with Matthew and said, hey, this is a protocol level issue. And he, from day one, he understood this, and he needed, I guess, some guidance on how to actually contact these coordination agencies, and that's the challenge, right? So we do have a really amazing team. We're kind of blessing here. They're based on the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, the CERT-CC. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go to cert.org and get more information about, that coordination agency. However, whenever it comes to something that affects a protocol that pretty much everybody that follows the standard, and I repeat, everybody, if you have a Wi-Fi sticker in your product or, in a client, whether it's a router, providing services, or your Mac, your Windows, your Linux box, and if it supports the protocol, you will be affected. Somehow you will absolutely be affected, especially about these 10 vulnerabilities that he originally reported. And I'm going to go over some of the new ones that he has reported, very, very recent. But at any rate, so at that point, every time that there's a protocol level issues like that, the first thing that I'm going to, think, hey, we're not going to be able to scale. That's number one. Second, and whenever I say scale to call every single vendor that is affected. And the reason that I say that is that even if we have coordination agencies like, CERT.org, or the Finland CERT also helps, the Japanese CERT. There's so many different certs around the world that actually definitely have a good process and tools to facilitate this coordination. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done. In some cases, as I mentioned whenever I started this presentation, whenever you try to contact somebody, and this is, I may sound like a parrot because you have heard this for many years. Every time that you try to actually contact a vendor or even an open source maintainer, right? Good luck if you're actually going to get an email. Good luck if you're going to head a PSIRT team. Those same challenges, are faced by these coordination agencies. Now, at the time, going back to this use case, right? Again, this was several years ago, but at the time, whenever CERT picked up the case, with us, basically they only had a handful of vendors that were, quote unquote, using WPA. However, at the time, the Wi-Fi Alliance had over 3,500 members. So that means that there were 3,500 vendors that were actually at least affected. And however, we only had points of contact from a coordination agency to just a handful of them, right? So, of course, with different NDAs, and we had to figure this out on how to bring, the Wi-Fi Alliance and, into the conversation, and all these, back and forth of potentially sharing the incident information and not. ICASI, which is another organization that, I have collaborated a lot. It's a nonprofit organization that Juniper, Cisco, IBM, Oracle, Microsoft, Amazon, A10, BlackBerry, Johnson Controls, a whole bunch of different companies. We have a whole bunch of NDAs where we actually share this type of vulnerability information. And now, days, this is actually something that we still do, right? And by the way, ICASI stands for the Industry Consortium for Advancement of Security on the Internet, a mouthful. So ICASI, has been also, in the middle of, coordinating some of these. Now, ICASI is actually working in partnership with PSIRT to basically drive towards a little bit more organized and repeatable approach for vulnerability coordination. And we have a special interest group that if you're part of a PSIRT a team, or a member, a company or organization, or even if you're not, you can absolutely feel free to participate in some of these industry approaches. But specifically, this one is actually being migrated and in partnership with PSIRT, and it will be actually deliverable of the vulnerability coordination SIG, kind of an FYI in there. But anyways, going back to the scenario here, right? At the time, again, a few years ago, we didn't have that much of a coordination, capability. Nowadays, it's a little bit better, but it's not by far perfect. Now, whenever we reported the vulnerabilities and all these entities were getting engaged, the first thing that comes out of to my mind, is this information is gonna get leaked. In no time, this thing is gonna get leaked. We already had security advisories, just ready to be sent, at least from the Cisco side. Because I actually, every time that I see these, somebody actually leaks the information, somebody actually says too much, and then, everybody gets 0 day, right? Luckily, in that case, it was one of the first times that did not happen, especially in the amount of vendors and the amount of people that were impacted. Now, after that, you saw things like Spectre and Meltdown. You saw things, just a little bit before and by the way, those 10 vulnerabilities that I mentioned, they were called the crack attacks. And, you can get more information about that. It's a little bit old now, but in the website that I'm sharing in here, right? Now, the reason that I bring that use case is because you fast forward all those years, and yes, we're getting better. It is 2021. Matthew Van Hoff just, reported several vulnerabilities that not only affect, WPA, but affects the latest protocol, WPA 3. Now, in those scenarios, we actually were able to prove again that the best practices that I'm about to actually share, they indeed work, right? And there was a very good coordination among a lot more vendors, a lot more industry, effort, like the Wi-Fi Alliance and many others, to find not only the solution, but in some cases, whenever these protocol level vulnerabilities are a lot harder to actually address. And the reason for that is because a lot of these protocol level vulnerabilities is, yes, you can patch and you can probably modify and put some mitigations in place in the vendor, but at the end of the day, the protocol has to be changed, right? So we have to think about many different things, like, am I going to be introducing some type of interoperability issue by the time that I'm providing a fix, right? Am I going to break a lot of legacy systems that may not be able to actually, technically afford that fix? So yes, it is 2021. It's getting a little bit better. However, going back to this diagram in here, let's say, again, in this case, the researcher, Matthew, reported a vulnerability to upstream vendors and the coordination agencies like PSIRT. We have now new tools, and kudos to PSIRT to create a little bit more modern tools. Very recently, one is called VINS, where, vendors can get notified instead of just by email. There's a platform that, we all collaborate and we share information with, vendors, and security researchers can, share information, prior to full disclosure. So whenever I say that, prior to actually, disclose the vulnerability, to the public, right? Allowing the vendors to at least patch. And in many cases, actually, the challenge is that some vendors, they are in the path, they're downstream vendors from others, right? So you have to wait for a fix to come from another vendor, right? So for example, if you are, somebody that is using the Android operating system, so of course, you have to wait for the fix to come from Android or from Google. If you are a customer of, distribution like Red Hat Enterprise Linux, in some cases, you actually have to wait for Red Hat to fix the issue. Now, in many cases, it's not only one downstream, but there are many, many downstream vendors. So it can be 0 or, a dozen. Now, the challenge with that is if for some reason, either the information gets leaked or we see active exploitation, because you're probably not going to be the only one that knows about a vulnerability, right? Even though you're a researcher and you probably found it, but probably the bad guys, already know about this, are exploiting. And in many scenarios, whenever I'm coordinating vulnerabilities industry-wide like this, in some cases, we actually see active exploitation even before the vulnerability is disclosed. And I'm not talking about that the researcher is sending the information to somebody else. There's no evidence, absolutely nothing like that. But that you're probably not going to be the only one that found that vulnerability. And if we find and, get a report of public exploitation, we will go public, right? I want to say we, at least, in the Cisco perspective, we will absolutely pull the trigger in a security advisory, even without a fix, because, we have to actually talk about mitigations. And even if there's no fixes or workarounds, at least by disclosing the vulnerability, and let me repeat this again, at least by disclosing the vulnerability publicly, your customers can make a decision whether to instrument their network, instrument their cloud service, whatever they're using to mitigate the issue, right? In many cases, actually people think that disclosing a vulnerability or counting CVEs is a bad thing, right? And it's absolutely the opposite. As a matter of fact, what I always recommend, and believe me, I actually come from a vendor, is this: make your vendor accountable, and then ask for vulnerability disclosure policies and processes before even you buy equipment from them or a piece of software, right? Because by knowing what vulnerabilities are there, whether they're internally found or found by somebody else, and one thing that you actually see very often in the industry is that some vendors, actually the majority of them, they will not disclose internally found vulnerabilities. And in some cases, what is worse, they actually do not even have a good process to find vulnerabilities internally. Now, again, going back to this process, in some cases, by the time that the upstream provider or the upstream vendor, finds the fixes or publishes a fix, by the time that the user, so the end consumer, has that fix in all these downstream other vendors, right? It can be days, it can be weeks, it can be months, or it can be never. I have been on the phone with multi-billion-dollar companies with very, very high-level, people in those companies, and to my face, in some of these scenarios, they have told me, we're not going to fix the vulnerability. We will just wait to replace the hardware, or we will just wait for X, Y, and Z, right? So again, this has to change, right? Now, the other thing is that prior to disclosure, going back to this security best practices, all parties definitely should have a clear and securely, some are secure communications, right? I mentioned tools that PSIRT has created. One is called VINS. Even if it's actually a security email using PGP, that still works nowadays, right? That's better than nothing, right? And in some cases, again, it's not only just having the email, but at least use PGP or something else. I mean, that's something very, very, very well known. Now, what we're trying to do in the industry is to come up with better ways to not only address this problem of finding the right contact in a company, but also to make sure that you have the appropriate things like your PGP keys, etc. Right? That's where security.txt comes into play. I'm actually sharing the link to basically a proposed standard, and this is an IETF, hopefully soon to be standard. It's an RFC to be hopefully soon to be adopted. But it's a really good concept into the fact that at least if you have some type of place in a well-known structure, let's say a /security in your company's website, that if you have a text file, and we only ask for a text file, security.txt, to have where to contact your company, the encryption PGP keys, or open PGP key, the security policy, which is very important, at least create some security policy. And then, of course, other information. You probably have an acknowledgements page or a bug bounty program, and, somehow to actually contact you. And in many cases, I also have seen this. It's very crazy. Yes, we do have bug bounties. Bug bounties work perfectly for some companies. They are not for everybody. And I repeat, I know that a lot of you actually participate in bug bounties and so on, and I am a big fan of bug bounties. I think that they definitely have the place and everything, but they will not solve everything in security. I still have to contact, in some cases, to a very small startup that they cannot even afford a security engineer, yet a bug bounty, to report a vulnerability of something that is super critical, that probably other vendors and other people in the industry are using their software. And in some cases, we consider somewhat of a critical infrastructure, right? Now, going back to the concept of security.txt, there is another very, very clever suggestion, best practice, or proposal, and it is to use DNS text records. And I think that a lot of you probably are aware of disclose.io, right? It's an amazing project, that have been created by a few colleagues in the industry, right? So if you're not familiar with it, please go to disclose.io. But within there, there was a proposal first being made in public in this GitHub repository that I'm sharing here. And basically is the ability for you to have a DNS text record that will also provide information about how to contact your company in the case that somebody finds a vulnerability, right? And what is your security vulnerability policy? And what are the things that security researchers, concerned citizens, anybody in the industry can have the correct channel for reporting security issues in the industry, right? And of course, the governing policies by the organization for all the systems under that, the domain, right? This is an amazing thing because now not only you can, yes, create tools for the security.txt information that I mentioned to you, but very, very easily just by doing a NS lookup or dig specifically, right? You can get these text records and actually get that information, right? It will be amazing, and a lot easier for us at trying to coordinate these multi-party, very large scale, vulnerability disclosure processes, right? It is very, very easy in some cases, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's in some cases also complicated, but it's often easier whenever you have a security researcher with one company or a security researcher with a bug bounty platform. But whenever it's, the time to disclose a vulnerability that affect 100, 200, 300, 2,500, 5,000 different vendors in the industry, it is a challenge, right? So we have to modernize the way that we are, doing, vulnerability management. Now, another thing that I want to actually come and present to you is something that we actually started in ICASI. So I was the chair of this standard formerly was actually known as the Common Vulnerability Reporting Framework, or CVRF. Now we have under a new name, right? So we have a new framework called the Common Security Advisory Framework. And the reason for that is because ICASI, and at the time, it was not a standards organization. Basically we had a whole bunch of NDAs between these vendors that I mentioned to you. We share vulnerability information. We said, hey, we have to come up with a machine-readable way to exchange vulnerabilities, right? Rather than just a CVE. And by the way, not all vulnerabilities has a CVE. And many people around the world, just because CVE, has a long history, and I work very closely with MITRE. And as a matter of fact, if you go to the GitHub repository for CVEs out there, you're probably gonna see my name all over, right? But I'm not saying that that's actually not the proper way. Absolutely, we should have an identifier. So that's not what I'm going at. But in many cases, whenever you're reporting weaknesses or misconfigurations that probably are not truly addressed in a CVE, we have to have a way, or a better way, to have a structured, machine-readable, format for security advisories and other information as well, to provide information about the mitigations and so on. So that's where CSAF is actually in play here. It is gonna be an OASIS standard. We have a 2.0 schema. It's a draft schema that you can access in this GitHub repository. There's a lot of active work as we speak. We have participants from around the world, not only from organizations like PSIRT and NIST and many other ones in the US, but also the federal government in Germany, a lot of multinational companies, a lot of non-profit organizations that are joining forces to come up with a better way to at least have our machines. Because the number one thing that I always say and I preach is that if you are reading my advisories, if I publish a security advisory and you're reading that advisory, I am doing a horrible job. And yes, I am saying that if you're reading my security advisory in an HTML page, I am doing a horrible job. Your machines should be reading by now my security advisories. Every time that I publish one out there, it should not be you. It should be the machines to be able to at least have some better ways of triaging the vulnerability, at least have some type of better ways of assessing the vulnerabilities in our networks, our cloud services, and so on, and also calculate risk, right? Now, just by looking at vulnerabilities themselves, of course, you cannot calculate, risk that goes way beyond, just vulnerabilities per se, right? It goes beyond. It's about losses. It's about the business impact, whether it's financial or business impact, which in turn turns into financial in many cases. But at the end of the day, whenever it comes to vulnerability disclosure, we have to move the needle and we have to move forward. We have to go beyond the picking up the phone, the sending an email, and we have to adopt these type of practices. I know that nowadays supply chain security is very, very important, not only because of the things that have been hitting the news in the last year or so, but it has been actually a problem that has kept up a lot of people up at night because of the challenges of disclosure, coordination, and the lack of agility in this scenario. So what I'm sharing in here is basically something that is a monumental effort within the security industry, from the Department of Commerce in the US, the NTIA, Linux Foundation, I mentioned CSAF, which I chair and lead, and many other places in the industry, not only in the US like NIST, but international, that we're putting our heads together to come up with an ecosystem of machine readable information, because again, has to be machine readable, on identifying and documenting what is the software that is actually running under the hood in any widget or any type of element that you buy from a vendor, or that may be also open source, right? For example, you may have a distribution, a Linux distribution, that is packaging many different upstream open source components. For example, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu, Debian, and so on. They all actually use the Linux kernel, right? They use things like libxml and OpenSSL, and they package them together, and then we use those distributions, and then we create our own products. And not only that, but of course we use Docker containers and many different other containers technologies out there to create applications and so on. And believe me, even though there are a lot of software composition analysis tools in the industry, those tools that are trying to determine what software is running in your systems, what open source software and commercial software may be running in your products and applications, those software composition analysis tools are not perfect. Basically, we're trying to attack the effort or the problem at the very late, in a very reactive manner. Why will I have to buy a piece of software to tell me what piece of software I'm running in my, in my environment? This should be done at the moment that you create code. And basically, that's the reason that we're actually trying to create this type of standards. Like, in the case of the software bill of materials, or what we call SBOMs, there are already standards that are being used, right? The problem is that we have too many standards, right? But we have things like the software package data exchange, or SPDX. We have software ID tags, which is an ISO standard. We have Cyclone DX that is also being used in some places around the industry. And we have identifiers, that we have used it from the past, like CPE, package URL or Perl, software ID tags I've already mentioned, but the software heritage, persistent IDs, and so on. Then we need to, after we determine what software is running in our products and in our environments, then what vulnerabilities affect such products? In other words, each of those components, what are the vulnerabilities that truly affect? I'm not talking about just a CVE list. I'm talking about, yes, I'm using this open source component in this widget. However, the vulnerability may not affect that or may not be exploitable in that component because you're not configuring a certain way, you're not compiling it in a certain way, you're not using a specific feature. So not because a vulnerability is affecting a version of an open source component or even a commercial component, that doesn't necessarily mean that the vulnerability is actually exploitable. So there has to be a better way to identify and marry those two type of things, right? What am I running? And is it susceptible, truly susceptible to a vulnerability, right? That's where the NTIA and a few other folks in the industry, including the Linux Foundation, including the guys behind CSAF and in Oasis, we're trying to come up with a way to represent that. There's an effort called the Vulnerability Exchange, and it's VEX, and where it's going to try to marry the two, the software bill of materials, and then what are the security advisories and the security disclosures, and specifically the vulnerabilities, and in some cases misconfiguration that we may be, or a broken protocol, it doesn't have to be a CVE, right? That may be already addressed and disclosed in a security advisory. That's where CSAF, or the Common Security Advisory Framework, comes into play, as well as, of course, the Vulnerability Exchange. So again, we have a long road ahead of us, but things are moving into the right direction. So the call to action that I have here for you to conclude is, please, whether you're a security researcher, whether you're a vendor, whether you're in academia, please get engaged. Please, go and participate in these efforts, both in the software bill of materials, activities from the NTIA or within CSAF. We're all actually a big, happy family that are actually working together to try to solve the problems, not only of the future, but the problems of today as well. Thank you again for being here with me to kick off Source Zero Con. I hope that you enjoy the next few days and take advantage of the content that has been created here for you. At this time, I would like you to navigate back to the Event Hub and select your next sessions, which, by the way, the next session begins at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again.